Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Booth, publisher at Genius Book Publishing and the host of The Other Side of the Story Conversations with Authors Who Know Too Much. And today we have Justin Bocock, who is a very interesting guy and multifaceted. He has been in the Secret Service, he has been in the Air Force, he has been a homicide detective and has retired from that position. He's written a book called On Call, and I'm going to let him introduce himself and introduce the book, and then we'll get into the questions. Justin, you want to talk about yourself?
Yes. Thanks, Stephen. That was a great introduction. My name is Justin Bocock. I started when I was 18. I joined the Air Force and I worked on large aircraft at McGuire Air Force Base, New Jersey, C-141B aircraft. Love airplanes, a little bit of a airplane aficionado. And in that process, what we did was we're a large aircraft. We actually transported the limos for presidential and dignitary movements. So I found out about something called the Uniform Division of the Secret Service. I didn't have a college degree. I was just joined right out of high school. So after I did 4 years in the Air Force, I applied with the Secret Service Uniform Division. It took about 3 years to get my security clearance to get the job. I'm in between of getting out of them, did 4 years in the Air Force, and I got out. I actually worked for United Airlines as an aircraft mechanic. And then 4 o'clock one morning, I got a phone call from the Secret Service, and they said, "Hey, you made it. The academy starts in 2 weeks, and we need an answer right now." So I said yes, and that started my law enforcement career. Never thought I was going to go into law enforcement. It just kind of happened. So Uniform Division of the Secret Service. Everybody's, what do you do? I was assigned to the Naval Observatory, the official residence of the vice president. At that time, it was Al Gore. I always said the Secret Service, greatest training in the entire world. It was a little boring for me. It was a lot of sitting around and waiting for something to happen. And I was still am a little high strung. I don't do sitting very well. So then one day, just someone had mentioned that the Mesa Police Department was hiring in Mesa, Arizona. And I knew of it because I was from Tucson, Arizona originally. And I ultimately applied with Mesa. And then in February of 1999, I ended up taking the job and left the Secret Service Uniform Division, came out to Mesa, Arizona, went to the Police Recruit Academy, and I really enjoyed being a local police officer. It was way more exciting for me. I got to drive around in a car, I got to drive fast, I got to pull my gun out. And as I started my police career, I did, as usual, patrol officer, and then I did a field training officer where I trained new officers. I really started to enjoy the investigation side of it. So after about 6 years with the Mesa Police Department, I tested for detective. I got nighttime detectives. So I worked beer runs, basically on the graveyard shift. That was my first assignment. But because I was on duty, I would get pretty much anything that came out. And I got a shooting once. Shooting happened, and like, are there any detectives on duty? And I was there, and I went out, and that was my first experience with dealing with violent crime as a detective, and I fell in love. And that's when I knew I want to be a violent crime detective. From there, I worked hard. I kept on the night shifts, and I went up from beer runs to vehicle burglaries, and then to robberies, and then armed robberies. And in armed robberies, I loved it, and never really thought never really had a desire to go to homicide. I always said, "Oh, it's going to be too sad. I don't have enough experience." And then one of my aggravated assaults, which is actually the first chapter of my book, On Call, it was a simple aggravated assault that turned into a homicide. And a senior homicide detective told me, "There you go. You just worked a homicide. So you can do it." So that year I tested for the homicide unit. I got it. That was in 2012. And then I spent the next 8 years in the homicide unit with Mesa Police Department. I retired after 20 years in 2021. And why retire early? Everybody says, "Why'd you retire?" That was always my plan. My plan when I went into the academy, I always said, I'm doing 20 years, going to get my pension, and then I'm going to do another career. And I'm still just like the Air Force. I just kind of walked into stuff. I'm just still looking for that other career and just using my experience to kind of get out there and see what's going on.
Great. And do you want to tell us a little bit about your book?
Yes. So On Call, case files from a career in homicide. I actually got the idea for that about my last 2 years in homicide. I remember it was about 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I was in the middle of a crime scene. I was really tired, and we were all joking about how tired we were. And then I remember saying, you know how many people out there would love to be doing what we do? Like they don't get to see the inside of a homicide investigation. My wife loves watching the TV shows where they go over investigations and homicides, but they always skip stuff. They start at the beginning and they're like, oh, and then this guy named John, and then John was in custody and they were arresting him and interviewing him. And I always say, hey, they skipped a whole part in there because you don't just show up on scene and then go and start interviewing people and get a arrest on there. So I really started focusing on, it would be interesting if people really saw how a homicide investigation unfolded. And that's what gave me an idea for On Call, where I got 13 of the most memorable or kind of exciting homicides that I had. And I kind of did a case study of them where I break them down and I go over how from the initial call out, his name On Call, the initial call out, what we learned in the beginning, and how through the progression of the investigation, things change from what you originally knew until the very end. And also some lesson learned in the middle, because with every case, I learned something new. I learned about bias, about, don't necessarily believe all witnesses' evidence. There's all kinds of things in there that can kind of twists and turns that led in those investigations, but still led to some sort of conclusion in investigation.
Great. Absolutely. I love it. Let's jump into the questions. And you sort of touched upon the first one. What made you decide that these particular cases were the ones worth sharing in On Call?
They were some of the most memorable ones that I had.
Mhm.
I'll be honest, just like most police work, sometimes homicides are very simple. We would show up, the guy was already there. He came out of the house and told patrol officers, hey, I did it, and I'm sorry. And nobody wants to read about that. It's still horrible, and it's still a horrible investigation, but there wasn't a lot of work. And I'm not saying that's all of them, but that was some of the homicides that we dealt with. And in Mesa, we would get about 20 to 30 homicides a year. So we got a fair amount of them. But I would say over half of them were fairly simple. They were domestic violence where you kind of had an idea, or where people would just turn themselves in and confess right away. The 13 I picked were ones that were challenging, also that I learned valuable lessons on, that I wanted to pass on to my true crime reader fans or true crime readers, but also anybody in law enforcement that can learn from the experiences that I made. Sometimes some of the mistakes that I made, some of the prejudgments that I made, and learn from my experiences. So that's why I picked the ones that I did.
Okay. One thing that we talked about early on when we were doing the project, On Call is the manual that detectives never got. And do you still feel that that's an accurate statement, or should I change my mind about that?
No, absolutely. You said that, and as soon as you said that, I'm like, you got it. You absolutely you got what I was selling.
Okay.
In police work, as a police officer, you go through the police academy. To become a detective, there really is no formal detective training. Now, when I was I made some training where we got the basics, but it's basically you learn through experience. Same thing with going from burglaries to robberies. There's no, robbery school. There's no burglary. It's you learn through experience, and you learn from other people's experience, where you hear, hey, what did John do on that case? Oh, hey, they did that. We even had a library in the police department of old case files, and they were the case files, but then they also said what the crime was on there. So if you didn't know, you could go and look up older robbery cases and say, hey, I have a serial robbery case. How did they solve that one? And you can go back and you can look at it if those detectives weren't available. Same thing in homicide. They have homicide schools, but they're really for that particular agency, because homicides are not like a checklist. It's not okay, you do this step first, this step second. Every one of them unfold differently, and everyone is differently. So detectives have to learn from other detectives, which means I'm only learning from people in Mesa, Arizona, or Phoenix, Arizona, which is our neighboring city. On Call is just exactly what you said. It's a manual where people who are interested in the field can learn from somebody who's not in their area. So they may get ideas on things that are very standard for how I do stuff, is not standard for how somebody in Illinois or Florida or something like that would do. And if it fits within their policies and guidelines, they can use that or bring it up and say, hey, we've never done this. but I heard this was done once before. So it's absolutely that manual. When you said that, I'm like, that's right on. That's right on.
Okay. Another question. At one point, when we were talking over the year or something like that, we were putting this project together. You said something about doing classes and speaking. Is that something that you're doing? And
Yeah,
is that part of the career that you're looking for, or is that something separate?
yeah. So I've looked into that, and I've started to put a class together. One of my old supervisors is now actually an assistant chief in another police agency, and he asked me about a year and a half ago. He's like, "Hey, my guys are in a small town. They get about one murder a year, and it's usually a bar fight where somebody dies. So it's a manslaughter." He's like, can you just put something together, just a quick class of, hey, if we do get a real murder, these are some things to consider. So I've actually got that lesson plan together because there isn't anything out there like it. I have had other companies interested in it, but that's never really worked out. I would just want to do it on my own. And then I literally I had the pamphlet all drawn up. I actually was starting to contact some local agencies. And then I got notified that the book was coming out and we were releasing literally the next day. So I've been really focusing on this project and then going from there. But that is my goal, is to get that out there, because there's not a lot of training out there. And it's more of, again, case studies. Talk about, this is something that I've done that worked. These are things I did that didn't work for me, but might work for you. Just keep it in mind. Things I've done that in court ended up working really horrible for me. Things I did that in court, people were like, wow, that really worked out great.
Yes.
We learn through experience in the law enforcement world.
Got it. How did your years in the Secret Service shape the way you approached homicide investigations later in Mesa?
That's a good question. I would say it taught me that law enforcement is different in different areas you go. I will use this example, and this is not a disparaging in any kind of law enforcement style. It's just law enforcement is different. When in the Secret Service, people knew who we were. If I went places, people would come up with you with free coffee and donuts and say, hey, I know you're in the Secret Service. Here's some coffee and here's some donuts. And Secret Service was okay with that. They're like, yeah, if people are going to offer you some stuff, especially if it's someone who's like, hey, I'm going to give you this if you give me something, that was obviously policy. Right. But like free coffee and stuff like that was just a thing. We're like, oh, cool. That was very, very nice of you. We're like, thank you. And they're like, oh, what's it like being in the Secret Service? And you talk to them and, and then they're going to talk to people and they're all that. When I went to Mesa was the exact opposite. And Mesa was very, very conservative in their policies, to where you couldn't even take a free coffee from convenience stores. Like if you're on duty in uniform and you went into a Circle K, 7-Eleven, that's what we have out here out west, or a QT or something like that, and you got a coffee and they said, oh, coffee is free for cops. They're like, you pay. And if you don't, it's a policy violation.
Wow.
So it was one of those things where I saw the difference in law enforcement. And again, not saying that one is wrong, one is right, but the difference in the policies. And I think that helped me in homicide investigations, where I realized that the Mesa way, or the way that we did it in Mesa, isn't always the way. There's other ways of doing things. And sometimes you have to think outside of the box. That sometimes comes with pushback from other people who are like, we've never done it that way before, so we're not doing it now. But if you get open-minded people, or if you keep going enough, I can be persistent and but like, hey, consider this. So I think working in different law enforcement agencies really helped me to see the different ways of doing law enforcement.
Okay. Great. I gotta ask you a side question. What was it like to get a phone call at 4:00 in the morning and they were like, make a decision right now?
Okay, so I was actually getting ready because I worked the day shift. So I was actually already up and getting ready for work. And the phone rings, and it was a landline. This is 1998. So it's a landline and it rings. First off, I'm thinking, oh, something bad happened back with my family. That's the first thing that came to my mind, is 4:00 in the morning, my phone's ringing, something happened at home. And I was living in Seattle at the time, and my family was in Tucson, Arizona. So I was in Seattle. And then I got the call, and I automatically said yes. I'm like, yeah, because they straight up said, if you say no, we're going to the next on list. So we need an answer right now. So I'm like, yes, I'll be there. And like, okay. And this is the old days. So they said, we're going to mail you the address that you need to be at. I went to my bosses and I was kind of apprehensive. Like, I need to talk to you. And they all knew I'd been applying for the Secret Service, because there were times I had to leave to get like my polygraph and things like that. So they all knew it. And they were like, you have to go. And I'm like, and they're like, dude, nobody gets this chance in life. I remember my manager was super cool. He's like, if you don't make it, if something happens, you always have a job here, but you got to go. He's like, we'll help you pack your tools. We'll help you pack your stuff. You have to do this because how many people ever get this opportunity? So they were really, really encouraging on, and I left that day. They out-processed me. I actually had friends help pack me up and put all my stuff in storage. And 2 days later, I actually drove to Tucson first to visit my mom. And then I drove to Washington, D.C. to get there in time.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a long drive. I've done drives like that. It is not my favorite thing in the world to drive that far. So
Yes, it was. Yeah, that was a whole nother adventure.
tell me about it another time. What does it mean personally, to you personally, to be on call beyond just being available for duty?
Yeah, another great question. So being on call was truly a state of mind. And we always said that. We always joked, oh, you're on call. Oh, you're on call. It's a state of mind. You have to be willing. It's kind of like law enforcement. I always said, well, I didn't say, they always told us in the academy that being a police officer is 90% boredom with 10% of sheer terror.
Mhm.
And there were times as patrol officer and I were graveyard shift where I was literally sitting in my car, real life situation. I was literally sitting in my car, getting ready to doze off because it's 3 o'clock in the morning and a call came out. And within 2 minutes, I had somebody at gunpoint. Then they're walking at me with a knife and I'm telling them, stop or I'm going to shoot you. Happened within just a couple of minutes. That's exactly what it's like to be on call. And I tried to portray that in the book where I talk about when I get the call outs, I cover the case studies from the moment that the call comes. So the sergeant will call the detective and say, hey, this is the murder that we have. Everybody needs to meet there. You have 1 hour to respond.
Mhm.
You could be sitting at home or you could be asleep. It usually happens when you're asleep. I don't know why, but usually right before you sleep, you just close your eyes and then that phone rings. And it's, hey, it's Sergeant so-and-so. And usually they'd say, hey, I'm going to give you a minute to wake up. And you're like, okay. I would leave the bedroom so I don't wake my wife up because and then go to the office and get a piece of paper and then go, okay, I'm awake. And they say, okay, this is what we have. This is the address. I'll see you there in an hour. We have an hour to respond. So you go from sleeping to shower, brush teeth, get a tie on. You already have your bag packed and you're leaving and you don't know what you're leaving for. There are times where I would leave and I would be back in 8 hours. There are times where I would leave and then I'd call my wife and say, hey, I got to drive to California because our suspect just got caught in California and we got to go do an interview. So I'll see you in a couple of days. You just never know what you're getting into. And you got to be mentally prepared for that. You got to be prepared that every time that phone rings, it could be an hour. And sometimes the phone would ring and it would just be like, hey, and they'd say right away, you're not being called out. I just have a quick question. And you're like, oh, okay, thank God. But then other times it was, oh, yeah, no, this is, or, hey, this is a big one. You know, we got 3 people deceased, this and that. And the guy's already in Mexico. And I got people going to the airport to fly to Mexico. You're going to be doing the scene. There's 4 scenes, and you're like, oh. So you have to be prepared to go from, again, just sitting completely still, doing absolutely nothing to getting your stuff ready. And you got to get in that professional mindset to get out there, focus, and get the job done.
Okay. Did being in the military prepare you for that last minute kind of you're on duty and that's it, you need to go? Or was that a different experience?
I think the military helped me more with the travel because I traveled a lot in the military. I was hydraulic and pneumatic specialist on C-141Bs. We were cargo planes and they were old cargo planes. Everywhere they went, they broke. So what they would do is the airplane I flew on a lot. It was actually a 1967 model aircraft. It was 670272. So everywhere it went, it broke. So what they started doing is they started flying people with it. They'd fly a crew chief, a hydraulics jet, and an electronic person with it everywhere it went so that when it broke, we could fix it and then try to keep our mission reliability. So I traveled a lot and I enjoyed it. I really enjoyed the travel. So I learned to kind of have that transient kind of lifestyle where I could pack a bag and live out of that bag for multiple days. That helped me with being on call. Being a police officer just helps you with the going from 0 to 1,000 in a split. That's just being a police officer. But being prepared, I always said, on call outs, you take care of yourself and you'll take care of the mission. So in my little go bag, I always had snacks. I always had water. I always had, because sometimes there was some serious downtime. So I'd always make sure that I had like some music to listen to. I always carried a blanket and pillow in the trunk of my car, because there were many times where I had to sleep in my car. And the military helped me with that, of basically being prepared. All of my stuff was shined, cleaned, prepared, and I was ready for any situation that came up. I could drive to California and be comfortable.
Mhm.
I could sleep in my car if I needed to.
Mhm.
I could do surveillance. And sometimes it was like, hey, Bocock, you're going to go do surveillance. And I'm sitting in a car. I had everything I needed for that. I had snacks. I had music. I had spare batteries for my
Mhm.
laptop, my phones. The military really helped me for that, of being prepared for anything.
Wow. That's a great answer. I'm glad I asked that question. Which case changed you the most as a person, not just as a detective?
Hey, so I think the case that probably affected me the most as a person was it was chapter 11, and it was the offer up murder. And I don't want to give too much away, but the victim of the case was it was a situation where a wife called in and said that her husband was missing, never came home from work. And the background was that he was a recovering heroin addict, and he had been sober for 5 years. They just got married. They were living with her mom, and he was doing side businesses. He was like buying laptops and things and then fixing them up and selling them, trying to save money so that they could get a house.
Mhm.
Well, she reported him missing the day before. Early the next morning, he was found deceased in a parking lot and had a single gunshot wound to his back. And his car was missing.
Mhm.
So I had to go and do the next of kin notification, or notify her that he was deceased, but also had to gather as much information as I possibly could. And talking with her, she was just, I mean, she's a young girl. He was a young guy. And she was so worried that he had relapsed and maybe stuff was going on. And that one was one of the harder death notifications that I've had, because I basically waited there until her mom came.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, they were staying with his mom when his mom came, so I could tell them together. So she had somebody there as I was with them. And I remember she kind of had an idea of what was going on, because we were talking and she was holding the cat that he gave her for their wedding, which was just a year earlier.
What?
And holding the cat and like sitting on the floor, Indian style. And I just got on the floor with her and was just like, we're going to wait till his mom gets here. Then we have some more to talk about. And she knew, and she was like, I know he's dead, and
Mhm.
I don't know what I'm going to do. And that really, I still think about them every day. It has really affected me. And the good news is we did solve that case. Again, that was one of our tougher solves. And I don't want to give away too much on the case, but it's because it did have that one had some twists and turns in it again, where people think one thing, and you can't be biased. You got to let the investigation lead you. But that one really affected me.
Mhm. Wow. Okay. Cool. Well, not cool, but I thank you for letting us know that. What surprised you most about how homicide investigations actually unfold compared to how they're portrayed in the media? I almost didn't get that out. You were talking about that earlier, where they leave things out. But, how is it different? What would you say is different about that?
That's a great question. And that's a great question. Just how complex they are, and complex in the sense of, in law enforcement, we almost always know who did it, but it's a matter of proving
Mhm.
who did it. And then the worst part is going to court, because you're only allowed to say a certain amount of stuff in court. For instance, I had, I believe it's chapter 2 or 3 in here, the domestic violence case, where the title of the chapter is Domestic Violence is Real. This guy beat his wife on a daily basis. But when he went to trial, the judge straight up said, you cannot say that, because if we say it, it's going to make him look guilty. So the
Mhm.
only thing you can say is they were constantly in close proximity to one another. Anything else is a mistrial.
Wow.
And we have to prove to a jury of 12 to 14 people that he is a domestic abuser daily. He daily
Mhm.
abused her, without saying that he daily abused her, where questions would come up and then and you can't be too suspicious, really. They were in close proximity to one another, because the judge is going to say, hey, you're giving things away. You have to be genuine about your answer. Like, and,
Mhm.
oh, did they be, and they try to like put you in they ask you a question, and the question, they were in very close proximity to one another, and then kind of move on. I'll let the reader get to that case too, because that's a good one that has a nice little surprise in it. But
Uh-huh.
that was the biggest thing is it's not just, okay, this person did it and everybody goes, yeah, of course they did it. It's the search warrants. And then the law gets involved, lawyers get involved, and they start this whole, well, you can't use that. We can't use this. That evidence, even though that evidence was gotten legally, we can't really use that because it was gotten by a co-defendant, or it makes our defendant look guilty. You know, if he writes a thing that says, I did it, it's prejudicial.
What does that mean? It makes him look guilty. The whole point is for him to look guilty, isn't it?
Yeah, and exactly. But in the legal realm, there are certain instances where certain crimes cannot be used, especially prior crimes, can't be used. If a guy's a serial rapist, you can't necessarily say that in court and go, hey, this guy's a serial rapist. He raped, 15 other people, and then he did it again. Because it makes him look guilty. You have to go with the crime that you have. Yeah, that was always the big thing of, well, they can't use that. That the prosecutors would say, we can't use that because that makes him look guilty. Yeah, because he is. And then so they'd say, well, we had to work around it. So there's all kinds of little behind the deals where it's not just developing probable cause, which, by the way, we talk about in the book. Real quick, just on the learning aspect of the book, I put a lot of things in there, call outs that explain what different things are. So you hear on the news all the time, well, there's no probable cause for this. I explain what a police officer uses for probable cause, which is basically 50% or more that the crime occurred. Just because me as a police officer believes that somebody committed a crime, a prosecutor has a different standard to prove, a preponderance of the evidence or beyond reasonable doubt. So that's where the weird part comes in on the homicides. To go back to your initial question, is I can say, yeah, there's probable cause 50% or more that this person committed the crime. But now, especially in a homicide, we got to get it to beyond reasonable doubt. Are 14 people going to agree with you unanimously that, yeah, this dude did it? And there's no other belief that anybody else could have done it. And there's a lot of little things that go on behind the scenes on that. And that's what I try to capture in the book to show the readers that it's a lot more than just, well, yeah, that's the guy. And then you put handcuffs on him and then you wipe your hands and you drink a beer and you say, hey, good job, guys. We did it.
That was actually something that I didn't think about. And Leah, my wife, is always watching those crime shows, so I get exposed to them. They never talk about that sort of thing. They rarely talk about the court aspects of it and what it takes to get all the way to a conviction. So that's fascinating. How do you balance the needs of emotional detachment with the empathy required to work with victims' families?
That's a really good question too. That was always a struggle. And the way I always did it for me personally, I saw a lot of detectives that would get very attached to some of their families. Some senior detectives who kind of mentored me when I first started, they always told me, hey, this is a marathon and not a sprint. And I didn't listen to them my first couple of years. And I went 1,000 miles an hour and I was constantly calling the families. I was there. You never go to the funeral or anything like you on the TV. That showed prejudice. But I definitely got myself emotionally involved. And like I said, we would get about 30 homicides a year, and I would be case agent on 4 to 5 of those a year, but you would work on at least doing other parts of it. So you're getting 10 to 15 homicides a year. And after about 3 years, having about 50 homicides and really close to 50 families, it really starts affecting you. And that's when I did have to start taking that advice of the mentors and hey, you have to start stepping back. So how I balanced it was, I always said, and I always told them, and I'd explain to them very honestly, hey, I'm going to investigate this crime. I'm going to keep you up to date on everything. But at the same time, I will never understand how you feel. And I will never say that to you. And with that, I'm going to give you space. So I'm going to give you my 24-hour number, and you call me with questions 24 hours, and I'm not going to bug you. And I kind of put it in a thing of saying to them more of, hey, you can rely on me, but I'm not necessarily going to push on you so much. And that really did help because they would call you with the questions, but then I wasn't always constantly calling them and saying, hey, good news and this. I did call them on that stuff, but you did have to step back and you do have to put up that kind of wall because it does affect you. And like I say towards the end of the book, towards the end of my 8 years in homicide, I did start to see the beginning of PTSD. I was starting to get more emotional. We were all trained in that, and I was trained as a peer support officer as well. So I knew that training, and I saw that it was starting to get to me. And that's when I also knew, hey, you got to get out because you can't deal with that much misery all the time and it not affect you emotionally. So you just do the best that you
Right.
can to kind of separate the two and do your job, but not take it personally.
One thing that I learned about dealing with families and death is the worst part of somebody dying on you is everybody else telling you they're how sorry they are, because then you have to console them. You know? so,
Yeah.
so I would imagine giving them space was probably a really good choice as far as dealing with the families is concerned. Okay.
Yeah, it worked good because it put the ball in their court and they could grieve how they want to grieve.
Mhm.
And if they wanted to include me, I would always be there, but I would also always, we would do the thing and then they'd call and say, hey, I was just thinking about my dad and this and that. And I would talk to them, but then I would like, okay, do you have any other questions about the case? No, I just wanted to say that, thank you for what you're doing. Okay,
Mhm.
I appreciate that. And it was a good dynamic. So yes.
Cool. What role does intuition play in your decision making when evidence alone isn't enough?
Another great question. In my book, I really try to get the bias out of there. All right. I try to show the non-bias that you should be in an investigation. Intuition is a great thing for a police officer. Intuition is a great thing for a detective. But intuition is not going to stand up in court, especially in a homicide case. So you really have to be careful about that. And I bring that up in a couple of cases where we get the initial call out and then everybody's kind of like, oh, it's going to be this person. This is an easy case. And it's like, hold on. Never investigate a case and let the evidence lead you to a person. So you really have to I would say intuition is more when I was a patrol officer and you're just
Mhm.
driving down the street and you see two people doing something and then they kind of look at you and then they split up and they go separate ways.
Mhm.
I think
Yeah.
that's when police intuition should come into play. I'm not saying they're guilty of things, but that probably you get a sense of like, that didn't seem right. And it may be completely honest because some people just don't like the police. You know what I mean? So it might just be they just wanted to leave. But that is where intuition comes in. As a professional investigator, you really kind of have to check your intuition and your hunches at the door, and you got to let evidence lead your way. Because if you go into a high profile homicide case and you say they did it because I think they did it, because they act creepy, because they're a weird dude. They're a weird dude. And I don't like the way that they answer my questions. They may just be weird. They may just straight person. And that's not
Right.
you have to have the evidence. So you got to so I think as a police officer, intuition is good, but as a professional investigator, you got to check that at the door. Use it to maybe help you like, okay, maybe this person needs a little bit more looking at. Let's do some more further investigation. But if that's all you have as an intuition, you don't have a case. And especially in a
Right.
homicide case where it's still the same standard, but let's be honest, it's going to be a higher standard because this isn't a burglary or a beer run. Like
Mhm.
this is a serious matter where people have the potential to go to prison for a long period of time. So
Mhm.
no one's going to make a mistake. So the professional investigator, you really got to check that intuition and you got to be smart enough to know when to check that intuition and kind of put it aside and say, we need to focus on facts and not what I feel.
Right. Well, you remind me of one of the authors that we interviewed recently is a guy named Paul Bishop. He's ex-LAPD and he's a interrogation expert. And one of the things he talks about is doing an interview and saying, "Yeah, that's your guy." Or sometimes he does an interview and says, "This guy is clearly a creep and not a very nice person, but he's not your dude." So that's what you're
Absolutely.
reminding me of. Is sometimes they're just different kind of people. So,
And I
um,
mentioned in the book, there's a lot of people that
mm,
they're lying. You can tell they're lying. But the problem is, what are they lying about? Are they lying about the murder? I've had people who have been interviewed for murder, which you can tell they're being deceptive and they're lying about something that later you find out they're lying about because they're having an affair. Because
mm,
they know you're getting ready to find out they're having an affair, or they're a drug dealer, or they're doing other bad things. They have child porn on their phone. They were lying about other things and not the murder. So you're like, oh, so he was lying because of that, not really because of.
mm,
Then you confront him with that, and like, well, yeah, I didn't do the murder, but I didn't want you to find out that I was selling drugs.
mm,
I'm a drug dealer. You're like, oh,
right.
well, I don't care about drugs. I'm a homicide detective. But then the drug
Right.
detective comes in and they're done. But anyway, you're right. People will lie to you.
Mhm.
don't always know what they're lying about.
Okay. That's also very interesting. What lessons from your own mistakes made their way into the book?
Ooh, another great question. So again, bias, prejudging a situation and saying, "Oh, this is going to be a pretty easy investigation," and then it turns out not to be an easy investigation at all.
Mhm.
Another one is, and I still kick myself to this day. I still think about that case, and I would tell other detectives. It's a situation where we had a robbery, and it was on a railroad track. Didn't have a lot of evidence. We had a deceased individual, clearly a robbery. There were casings, so a semi-automatic handgun had been used, and there was
Mhm.
this yard right next to the railroad track that had a wooden fence, and the yard was kind of like a junkyard almost. It had a bunch of old cars in there, and the owners were very cool, and they let us search it multiple times. I searched that yard personally 3 times and didn't find a gun in there. And we just are not finding the gun on this case, which we really could have used. And then about 2 weeks later, it had rained really hard in Arizona, and the owners went and they emptied the bucket that was in their yard that was full of dog poop. They emptied that in the trash, and they heard a plunk, and they
Mhm.
looked in the trash can, and there was a gun in there. So
Oh
they call us
no.
up and go, "Hey, we found a gun in the dog poop bin." And I remember looking in the dog poop bin, but it was full of dog poop. And I'm like, "What's a dog poop bin?" I never like dug through it or anything. Yeah, the gun had been in the dog poop bin the entire time. And
Oh
of
wow.
course, it sat in dog poop and then was covered in water. So now our DNA and our fingerprints and all of that is not, it was our gun. It matched ballistically,
Ballistically, yeah.
but DNA and fingerprints are now destroyed. And I always kick myself because I looked in that bucket 3 times, but was like, "Oh, it's full of poop." And
Mhm.
I just see poop. They didn't like lay it on top. No, they put it
Mhm.
underneath the poop. And so, little things like that where I hope that somebody, if one detective or one officer who reads this and then later on is doing a search and goes, "You know what? There's a dog poop bucket. Let me just dump it out and double check it because I read this book once where they did I prevent and I can maybe find that gun before all the DNA gets done, that I
Mhm.
consider myself a success." And that's
Wow.
the failures that I really want to portray to people of, "Hey, I messed up on that and do better."
Okay. This is actually this next question is almost exactly leads in from that. How do you teach young detectives to recognize and avoid confirmation bias during an investigation?
Another great question. You have to, I think the biggest thing is you have to tell them, you have to accept it yourself. Telling somebody their bias, they may not always be receptive to that.
Mhm.
But you as a detective, you have to have enough forethought and knowledge to know that when you say that, say, "Hey, I may actually be biased on that. I may actually only be doing this to confirm what I already believe." And you have to
Mhm.
challenge yourself. And that's what I always tell newer detectives is challenge yourself. If you're doing something, and I was just the example of like, I know that I'm crazy because I can't sit still. So
Mhm.
I always joke about that. I'm like, I know that that's what I am, and I accept it. Accept that you are biased because you're a police officer and that you see this like, well, that's the person to do it. Then laugh about it and then say, what evidence and proof do I have that they are beyond what I have? And if you can answer
Mhm.
something else, you have evidence. If you don't, find it. You can still investigate it and look into it, and you may find that there is evidence to support what you have, but you also may find there's evidence to not support what you have. So still
Mhm.
keep that person in mind, but let the evidence lead you to where you are. So I think the biggest thing is self-reflection. As a professional investigator, as a professional detective, and even as a somebody who looks at or is a true crime fan,
Mhm.
you too have to realize, hey, where's the bias? Where's my bias? And let me not just get what I'm told, do my own research and see what I can find from there. So I think it's more of a self-respective thing. You have to realize it, laugh it off, and then
Mhm.
be curious. Be curious and investigate it yourself, and you'll find the answer.
Wow. Okay. What's the most misunderstood part of a detective's jobs from the public's point of view?
Ooh, another great question. Probably it's probably the speed of which things happen. Everybody, we have a crime now, and even in the crimes that I talked about, and immediately a murder would happen. We just finished, so we get called out. The first thing that we do is we do an incident briefing. Command staff and the news media would immediately come over and be like, "Okay, who did it? Who's going to be in custody?" And what time can we do a news release and tell everybody that the world is safe? It doesn't work that way.
Mhm.
Sometimes things take time. And I think that's the biggest misconception, is that everybody thinks that this is all going to go very, very super fast. There's a lot of
Mhm.
behind the scenes we've already talked about, but you got to get search warrants. You have to look at the evidence. You have to process evidence. Even when people are nowadays, they talk about phones, like, oh, we'll get the person's phone and that will tell you. That's wonderful if you can get into their phone.
Yes.
And we hear that all the time. We're like, oh, we'll get into their phone. If their phone is locked and it's a certain type of phone, the forensic people, it could take months or years for that phone to become unlocked, because you can't just turn it on and just start flipping through that phone. You'll
Right.
destroy evidence. And people don't always understand that. And like, but we should be able to get in there quicker. Agreed. And not only that, I've gotten into people's phones, and especially younger people who do everything on their phone, and
Mhm.
it's in a PDF format. So it's basically like a book, almost like a digital book. The most I've ever seen was about 35,000 pages. So now that's 35,000 pages of stuff that you have to look through, and you have to look through every single page. You got to go through that. And it may not be the case agent, but somebody's got to do that. And even if you split that
Wow.
up amongst a couple of detectives, that takes time. And then you got to talk together. And sometimes you don't know what you're looking for the first time you go through it. And then you learn new evidence. Oh, John talked to a guy named Jim. Oh,
Mhm.
I think I saw Jim in his phone records. Let's go through it again. I think
Mhm.
that's the biggest misconception that people have in the detecting world, is that they think that we have access to everything all at once, and that we can
Mhm.
snap our fingers and make this evidence pop up, and also that there's multiple people working it. Sometimes, especially Mesa, we were very lucky. We had a pretty large police agency. Our homicide unit was 10 people. But even if we got all 10 people on board, that's only 10 detectives.
Mhm.
All these smaller agencies, you're looking at 1 or 2 detectives, maybe, and then you're going to officers, maybe even you're using civilians. So time, people really need to kind of be patient and wait for the
Mhm.
true facts to come out. And that's hard for people to do, but that's definitely the biggest misconception of a detective.
Okay. I was going to say something interesting and I forgot what it was. So let's move on. What part of the justice process do you think the public would be most surprised to learn about after reading your book, The Justice Process?
The, uh, from going from the probable cause arrest that a police officer, like a sworn officer like myself, would make, to the legal process. And I
Mhm.
try to put that into the book. I'm not a lawyer, so I try to explain things how things are explained to me. For
Mhm.
example, I talk about co-defendant statements. So if 2 people commit a crime, I can use their statements against, so person 1, if Jim says, yeah, John and I robbed the bank, and John goes, Jim and I robbed the bank, I can use that to develop my probable cause and arrest
Mhm.
Jim and John for robbing a bank. When we
Mhm.
go to trial, Jim can't testify against John, and John can't testify against Jim unless the lawyers do lawyer things and make deals with people. So people don't always
Mhm.
realize that. So now we have to go to a jury and convince them that John robbed a bank without talking about Jim. So, but
Okay.
yet I was allowed to use Jim to make the arrest. So that's the biggest. And I do it in a way where I explicitly say, 1, I'm not a lawyer, and 2, I'm not coming down on lawyers. It's just the way the legal system is, and it has to be that way, because that's what makes this system good. Is that there's this constant check and balance. Is that I can
Mhm.
arrest somebody with probable cause, which is a lower standard, but by the
Mhm.
time it goes to trial, the lawyers have to make it beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a really high standard, and that way we're not putting innocent people in jail. So it's a lot of work and it's hard sometimes, but it's effective, because then you're punishing the right people and not punishing the wrong people. But that's the biggest disconnect, and I talk about that a lot on almost every case, because like every case study goes from the initial call out all the way to you find out what they were sentenced, how the court proceedings went, and basically the
Mhm.
end of the case.
Here's a question off script. Have you ever had a case where you felt you had the evidence, you knew the guy did it, there were witnesses who saw him do it, and the DA or whomever it is that you were dealing with declined to prosecute?
Yes.
Okay. Can you talk about that
Absolutely.
at all? Or
None of those are in the book. So all the cases in the book have been adjudicated. First off, all the names have been changed, including the names of the detectives, except for me. They've all
uh,
been changed. but they've also all been adjudicated. I mean, they've gone through the legal process, to include the appealed process, because I don't want to affect any cases.
Mhm.
So I don't have any of those cases in there. But yes, there is. I had a couple cases where I know the person did it. I know they did it, but I don't have the evidence. I presented it to the county attorney, and I've tried to, and I pushed for him. And I retired. When you retire as a homicide detective, all the cases you have go to your replacement. So they handle your court stuff and all that. I only had one or two unsolved, but both of those were solved. Like the suspects were identified. I had evidence, but the county attorney was not happy with the amount of evidence. They wanted more. So there's like, we want more. So that's one of those situations where we always called it, you want that case to kind of ruminate a little bit. If you let it sit, people who commit crimes typically don't just commit crimes and then never commit a crime again. They usually commit crimes today and then they continue criming. Or other people will do crimes and get caught. And then they go, hey, I may have been caught with this, but I have information on this person who committed a murder 5 years ago. And, and then the ball gets rolling on that kind of thing. So yes, I did have a couple of cases where, yes, I knew it was them and it was frustrating. And I briefed the county attorney, and sometimes we'd have some heated discussions where they'd say, well, but what about this? And I'd say, that's great. But what about this? And then we had a good adversarial relationship, but that's what it has to be, because that's what it's going to be in court, is adversarial, because the defense is going to say, hey, this, and this. And they say, that's fine. If they say that, I counter with the following. And and sometimes you convince them. There's times where they go, you know what? All right, you convinced me. Let's give it a shot. And sometimes they're like, I like your heart and I agree with you, but we can't win it in trial,
Right.
Trial case. Get me something that we can go to trial and win, and I'm there with you. They were always very receptive.
Cool. In the process of writing On Call, what did you discover about yourself that you didn't know before?
Oh, wow. One, I remembered a lot of these cases, because some of these cases were back in like 2012, and I wrote the book between 2021 and 2023. It took me a couple years. And as I was writing, I'm like, oh, I remember. And then, I remember this. Oh, I remember I was wearing my purple shirt that day. And and it really, and also it was kind of therapeutic, because I also started having kind of the emotions again, but I felt good about it, where I was writing it and I'm like, oh, write that emotion and write how you really felt about that, and how you felt bad for the families and how their reactions affected you. And even sometimes the suspect families, because their lives are ruined too. They didn't do anything wrong. And then now their lives are just in complete disarray. So I really learned a lot about my recall, but I always took it for granted. I think a lot of us take our life experiences for granted. And as I'm writing this, I'm like, wow, I did have an interesting career. To me, it was just a job. I woke up, and 2:00 in the morning, I'd go and I'd go through a crime scene and I would do all that stuff. But as I'm writing it down, I'm like, wow, this is really, it's kind of interesting. Like, even from a person who's out of the system or out of it for a couple of years now, I was like, I had kind of an interesting career, where you don't always think that. And I think that's a majority of people. A lot of people have some really good life experiences, that if you just put it down on paper or talked about it, people would be, wow, that's really interesting. I've never even thought about that, or I've always wanted to do that. So those are the two things I kind of learned about myself.
Okay. Also, I would like to throw out there that what you did was important. It wasn't just a job. You were making differences in people's lives. Sometimes they weren't happy with that difference, but sometimes they were, that kind of thing. So, how do you feel about the importance of the job that you were doing?
Again, I think that after the fact, I felt really good about it. At the time, you really don't. After the conviction, you kind of, I always said the post-conviction's high, you'd always get that, yeah, we did it. It was kind of almost a self-aggrandizing, look at me, I succeeded. You know what I mean? Like, I did a good job on it. But then it's afterward, when you really start reflecting on it, that you start thinking like, okay, I did help people out. And you're right. There are some defendants who are in jail and they did commit crimes and they are murderers that I still feel bad for. Not that they didn't do it, just that the amount of sentence that they had, it's just that some of them never really had a chance in life. They were dealt a bad deal from the get-go, drug addiction, homelessness, just all the stuff that we see on the news. But and you feel bad for them. They still committed a crime, and they still, and I'm not here to determine, to say what's right or wrong. That's the judicial system. But the
Right.
evidence and the facts were there. But you feel for them too. So it is important. And I look back and I'm very happy with my 20 years as a police officer, because I always said I would do things when I did it. I always said I would do it and not have any regrets. But I don't. I never compromised myself. I never compromised my integrity. I always did what I thought was right. And I'm proud of the service that I did on that.
Mhm.
But I don't necessarily focus on it as like, oh, I got justice for this person. I never looked at myself as getting justice for anybody. It was
Mhm.
of bringing it to the case. Justice is for the family. I
Mhm.
feel, and I always said that, I will never bring a family justice. That's for the court to do. And that's for you to feel. That's you. The families will determine whatever you need to do to feel that you have gotten justice. I'm not the victim. I'm not wrong. But I do feel very, very confident that everything I did was on the up and up. Everything I did, I feel good about. And I felt like I did a good solid for both the victims and the defendants, because
Mhm.
there's no defendant that I've had that is like, oh, well, they may be innocent, or
Yeah.
no, they're definitely guilty. The evidence is definitely there. So yeah,
Okay.
kind of a catch-22. Kind of a catch-22. That was kind of a weird answer to your question, but
No, I understand. Okay, we're gonna wrap up, but I like to finish off with this one question, and it's always interesting to see what the answers are. Was there anything that you were expecting me to ask you or would like me to ask you that I did not?
oh, that is a good question. No, I thought they were great questions. Thought they were great.
Okay.
I thought they were great questions, but nothing that I can't think of anything that I would have been like, oh, why didn't you ask this? No.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you. That's great. Justin Bocock, I really appreciate you coming on the program, and it was a great interview. I think people are going to really engage with this, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for taking the time. I appreciate it.
No problem.